For a short while on a Sunday afternoon in 1960, the entire planet rang like a struck bell. That is not a metaphor, it is a measurement. The energy released off the coast of southern Chile that day was so enormous that the Earth itself began to vibrate as a single object, swelling and contracting by tiny amounts over cycles lasting about 54 minutes, and it kept doing it for days afterward. Instruments on the other side of the world recorded it. It was the first time in human history that scientists had ever observed the whole planet oscillating, and they only got to observe it because something had hit the Earth hard enough to make it hum. It has never happened again, not once in the 66 years since. The earthquake that did it remains, by a comfortable margin, the most powerful ever recorded by scientific instruments anywhere on Earth, magnitude 9.5. There is a serious argument among seismologists that nothing larger is physically possible on this planet, because there may simply be no fault long enough to produce it. But the number is not the reason this story is worth telling. The reason is what the people of southern Chile were doing in the minutes before it began. They were not going about their day unaware. They were not caught by surprise in their beds. They were standing outside in the cold, in fields and plazas, having already survived one enormous earthquake the previous morning and two more since, and they had reached the entirely reasonable conclusion that the worst was behind them. Everything they believed at 3 o'clock that afternoon was wrong. They were wrong about the earthquake, which was still coming. They were wrong about the sea, which would arrive within 20 minutes. And a great many of them were wrong about the thing that would come closest to killing them, which was not the earthquake and was not the ocean, but a lake, quietly filling up in the mountains behind their homes, with enough water in it to erase every town along a river valley in under 5 hours. 3 disasters, stacked one on top of another across 10 days. This is how they happened, and how the people caught between them survived. To understand what was lost, you have to know what was there. Chile in 1960 was a country in a confident mood. The post-war years had brought industry, expansion, and a sense that the future was arriving. And in the south, the city of Valdivia was one of the places where that felt most obviously true. Valdivia was unlike anywhere else in the country. Its character had been shaped by waves of German immigration in the 1800s, and it showed in the architecture, the surnames, the food, and the businesses. It had shipyards, it had tanneries and timber mills feeding off the vast forests inland. It had breweries with a reputation across Chile. It sat in a landscape of rivers that functioned as highways, carrying cargo down to the coast at Corral, where the bay had been fortified since the days of the Spanish Empire. Life ran on a settled rhythm. Valve radios in the corner of the front room carrying news and cereals in the evening. Wood smoke rising over the neighborhoods and mixing with river mist, because May in southern Chile is the beginning of a long, wet winter. Shops shuttering at dusk, families gathering around a table. Children coming home from school along streets where the buildings had stood long enough that nobody thought about them at all, which is the highest compliment a city can be paid and the last one it usually receives. And earthquakes, which were simply part of the deal. Chileans have lived on moving ground for as long as there have been Chileans. Small tremors were ordinary. A crooked picture frame, a rattling window, something falling off a shelf, and then the conversation resuming where it left off. That familiarity is a kind of resilience, and Chile has more of it than almost any country on Earth. But familiarity has a cost, and the cost is that when something genuinely unprecedented begins, the first instinct of everyone involved is to file it under things that have happened before. What was happening beneath them had been building for centuries. Along the whole length of the Chilean coast lies one of the most active tectonic boundaries on the planet. The Nazca Plate, carrying the floor of the Pacific, is being forced underneath the South American Plate at a rate of a few centimeters a year. Most of the time this happens through slow, grinding, unremarkable movement. But in places the two plates lock together through sheer friction and stop sliding, while the pressure behind them keeps building. The rock deforms. It stores the energy the way a bent steel bar stores it. From the surface, nothing whatsoever appears to be happening. Farms are farmed, cities are built, generations pass. Off the coast of southern Chile, a segment of that boundary roughly 800 kilometers long had been locked for a very long time. Saturday, the 21st of May, is one of the most important dates in the Chilean calendar. It is the Day of Naval Glories, the anniversary of a famous battle, and by tradition it is marked with parades, flags, school ceremonies, and the president's annual address to the nation. None of it happened as planned that year. At 6:02 that morning, while most of the country was still asleep, a major earthquake struck near the coast, south of Concepcion. Magnitude 8.1. That is not a minor event by any standard. It is a great earthquake, the kind a country might expect to deal with once in a generation. Concepcion, Libu, Curanilahue, and the towns of the Arauco Peninsula took the worst of it. Adobe walls, which had held up entire neighborhoods for a century, came apart. Facades fell across sidewalks, public buildings cracked, roads split. Power lines went down and telephone links failed, so that the rest of the country learned what had happened slowly, in fragments, over hours. The national celebrations were abandoned. The president's ceremonial day turned into an emergency response. Families in the affected towns spent that Saturday hauling their belongings into the street and preparing to sleep outdoors in the winter cold rather than risk another collapse. There is a detail about that Saturday that tells you how the whole weekend would go. Adobe is an old and in many ways excellent building material. It is cheap, it insulates beautifully against the southern winter, and thousands of Chilean homes were made of it. But adobe has no tensile strength whatsoever. It cannot be stretched or bent, only compressed. When a wall of it is shoved sideways hard enough, it does not crack and hold. It turns back into what it was made of, which is earth, and it does so on top of whoever is inside. Much of what fell that Saturday morning fell that way, and much of what survived Saturday had been quietly ruined without anyone being able to see it. Hairline fractures ran through walls that still looked solid. Roof beams shifted a few centimeters in their seats. Every one of those houses was now a structure that would fail at a fraction of the force it had just withstood, and their owners had no way of knowing. By any normal reckoning, that was the disaster. A magnitude 8.1 earthquake is a national catastrophe, a headline for a year, a thing people date their lives from. We now know it was a foreshock. The night that followed was not restful. People stayed near doorways or outside altogether, listening. Small tremors kept arriving. Radios stayed on. Then, at 6:30 on Sunday morning, the ground moved hard again. Magnitude 7.1, in roughly the same area. More damage on top of damage. More walls that had been weakened on Saturday now coming down. And here is where human psychology does something completely understandable and completely wrong. 2 big earthquakes in 24 hours reads, to almost anybody, as a sequence winding down. The intuition is that pressure has been released, that this was the event and these are its aftershocks, and that the curve goes downward from here. In 1960, even the specialists would have leaned that way, because the science that describes how one great earthquake can transfer stress along a fault and load the next segment was not yet mature. There were no global monitoring networks feeding real-time data to anybody. There were no computer models of a subduction zone. So through Sunday morning, southern Chile did what people do. They began to clean up. Shopkeepers swept broken glass out of doorways. Neighbors compared damage. Families who had spent 2 nights outside began carrying bedding back indoors. The radios reported on the recovery. The mood was not calm exactly, but it was shifting from fear toward exhaustion and relief, which is a very particular and very dangerous mixture. Meanwhile, offshore, the stress released by Saturday's earthquake had been passed along the plate boundary and dumped onto a locked segment far larger than the one that had just broken. At 3:05 in the afternoon, the ground moved again, and this one was bigger than anything yet, magnitude 7.8. People who were indoors ran back out into the open. Structures already damaged twice now failed. Anyone still telling themselves the sequence was over stopped telling themselves that. 16 minutes later, the largest earthquake ever measured on this planet began. At 3:11 in the afternoon, local time, on Sunday the 22nd of May, 1960, the locked segment finally let go, and it did not stop letting go for a very long time. Survivors described the same thing again and again. Before they felt anything, they heard it. A deep sound rising out of the ground, low and enormous, arriving ahead of the shaking. Animals reacted before people did. Then the ground started to move, and it kept moving. This is the detail that separates the Valdivia earthquake from every other earthquake in the modern record. Great earthquakes are usually measured in seconds. A minute of strong shaking is extraordinary and terrifying. Here, the rupture tore along the plate boundary for something on the order of 800 kilometers at roughly 3.5 kilometers per second, with the 2 plates slipping past each other by more than 10 meters on average, and by 25 to 30 meters in places offshore. The shaking went on for approximately 10 minutes. Try to sit with that. Not 10 seconds of chaos and then stillness. 10 minutes. Long enough to run out of adrenaline. Long enough to get up, fall over, get up again, gather children, cross a room, get outside, and still be standing in the open with the world moving under you, and no indication whatsoever that it is going to stop. Survivors describe holding on to fence posts and tree trunks. They describe the ground moving in visible waves across open fields. They describe watching neighbors trying to walk and simply being unable to. There is a particular cruelty in a 10-minute earthquake, and it has to do with hope. In a normal one, there is a moment perhaps 30 seconds in when the shaking begins to fade and the body understands that it is going to live. In this one, that moment kept not arriving. People reported reaching a point where they simply stopped believing it would ever stop and started making a different kind of decision. Not how to get through the next few seconds, but what to do with whatever was left. Mothers put children under door frames and lay across them. Men held gates shut. Some people prayed, some counted, and a great many later admitted that at a certain point they concluded the world was ending and were surprised to find that it had not. In Valdivia, the geology made everything worse. Much of the city sits on soft, water-saturated sediment laid down by its own rivers. Under prolonged violent shaking, ground like that can undergo liquefaction. The grains of soil lose contact with one another, the water between them takes the load, and for a period of time the earth beneath a building behaves less like solid ground and more like a thick liquid. Buildings did not simply crack, they sank, they tipped. They settled at angles into ground that had temporarily stopped being ground. And then something happened that no one in the city could perceive at the time, and that would only become clear in the weeks that followed. The land itself dropped. Across a wide area around Valdivia, the surface subsided permanently by roughly 2 meters. Farms that had been dry for generations became marsh. The rivers redrew themselves. The relationship between the city and the water around it changed forever, in 10 minutes, and nobody realized it while it was happening. When the shaking finally eased, the survivors were standing in a landscape that had been altered in ways they had no framework for. Communications were cut, roads were broken, bridges were down, entire districts were wreckage. And out in the bay, the sea was doing something strange. Along the coast at Corral, at Niebla, at Bahia Mansa, and Puerto Saavedra, people who had come outside to check on their families noticed that the water was leaving. Not falling with the tide, leaving. Withdrawing hundreds of meters, exposing seabed that no living person had seen uncovered, stranding boats on mud, revealing rocks and channels and lost objects. In some places, people walked out onto it. Today, that site is taught to school children across the Pacific as the clearest natural tsunami warning that exists, and the instruction is absolute. If the sea withdraws, run inland and uphill immediately, and do not stop to look. In 1960, that knowledge was not widespread. To most of the people watching, the retreating ocean was bizarre and fascinating rather than a countdown. The cause was straightforward. The rupture had lifted and dropped huge sections of the sea floor along hundreds of kilometers of coast, displacing an almost unimaginable volume of water, and that displacement was now propagating outward across the Pacific as a series of waves carrying colossal energy. The first waves reached the Chilean coast within about 20 minutes of the earthquake. They were not waves in the sense anyone standing on a beach would recognize. A tsunami is not a breaker. It is the sea itself arriving, a wall of moving water that keeps coming for minutes, then drains back out, taking everything it can carry with it, and then does it again. On parts of the Chilean coast, the water reached heights of around 25 meters. Corral, the port that served Valdivia, was devastated. Harbor works were destroyed. Ships in the bay were thrown around like objects in a bathtub. One cargo vessel was carried helplessly through the bay and up the river for hours before finally being wrecked and abandoned, with 2 of the men aboard lost. And it did not come once. This is the thing survivors of tsunamis always emphasize, and that people who have never seen one always get wrong. The water arrived, withdrew, and came back several times over the course of hours, and it was not always the first wave that was the largest. People who returned to their homes in the gap between waves to save a relative, a document, an animal, were caught by the next one. Some of the worst losses of that afternoon happened to people who had already successfully escaped. At Puerto Saavedra, further north, the damage was so complete that the town could not simply be repaired. The wave pushed inland across low ground, tore through the river mouth, and reshaped the coastline itself. Mapuche communities who had lived along that shore and around the lake behind it for far longer than the Chilean state had existed lost homes, boats, and land in a single afternoon. What the sea did to that stretch of coast rewrote the map, and the town had to be rebuilt in a different place. Families whose ancestors had been there for generations left permanently. For thousands of people, this was the moment the day became unbearable, because it arrived exactly when they thought it was over. They had survived a sequence of earthquakes across 2 days, and the last of them had been 10 minutes long. They had gotten their families out, and then the ocean came up the streets. The estimates of how many people died in Chile that weekend still vary widely, from around 1,000 at the low end to as many as 6,000. The reason for such a wide range is grim and simple. In coastal communities hit by a 25-meter wave, there is often nothing left to count. What is not in dispute is the scale of what came after. Across southern Chile, on the order of 2 million people were left without a home in the opening weeks of a Patagonian winter, in a country whose roads, bridges, ports, and telephone lines in that region had all been destroyed on the same afternoon. What that meant on the ground is easy to state and hard to imagine. The southern winter was beginning. Rain in that part of Chile is not an occasional event, it is the climate. Hundreds of thousands of people were living under canvas and salvaged roofing, in mud, with no electricity, boiling river water where they could get fuel. The region's transport network had been cut in every direction at once, so the parts of the country that were unhurt could not easily reach the parts that were. Aid came in by sea and by air, from the Chilean state, from the United States, and from a long list of other countries, but for the first days, many communities were simply on their own and knew it. And in the middle of that, the aftershocks kept coming, dozens of them, some large enough in their own right to have made news in an ordinary year. But the ocean was not finished, and the story stopped being Chilean. Deep water lets a tsunami travel at the speed of a jet aircraft while losing very little energy. The waves generated off Chile spread across the entire Pacific basin. About 15 hours later they reached Hawaii, and here is the uncomfortable part. Hawaii was not unwarned. A Pacific warning system already existed, built after an earlier disaster, and it worked. The alert went out hours in advance, and sirens sounded in Hilo that evening. The system did its job, the people did not. Some had experienced a tsunami warning a few years earlier that amounted to very little, and had learned the wrong lesson from it. Some assumed a wave from South America would be exhausted by the time it crossed the ocean. Some went down toward the shoreline to watch. The water came into Hilo Bay at around 10.5 meters and went through the Bayfront district, moving buildings off their foundations and bending steel parking meters flat to the ground. 61 people died there, on an island more than 10,000 kilometers from the fault that made the wave, most of them with several hours of warning they chose not to act on. That failure changed public education about tsunamis across the Pacific as much as the wave itself changed the warning technology. Roughly 22 hours after the earthquake, the waves arrived on the Pacific coast of Japan, striking hardest along the Sanriku coast in the northeast. Well over 100 people died there. It was the middle of the following day. The shaking had happened on the other side of the world. There had been no felt warning of any kind. Communities woke up to a normal morning and were struck by an earthquake that had occurred the previous afternoon in the southern hemisphere. The Philippines were hit as well, with dozens more killed, and the waves were measured in New Zealand, Australia, along the west coast of North America, and as far away as the coasts of Asia and the Pacific Islands. Tide gauges around an entire ocean recorded the same signature, hours apart, radiating out from one point off the coast of Chile, like a stone dropped in a pond the size of a hemisphere. This is the fact that changed how the world thinks about the ocean. Before 1960, a tsunami was mostly understood as a local problem for the coast nearest the earthquake. After 1960, it was undeniable that a rupture in one country could kill people on the far side of the planet a full day later. The International Tsunami Warning System that now covers the Pacific, the network of buoys, tide gauges, and warning centers that routinely gives Japan and Hawaii and the American West Coast hours of notice, grew directly out of what happened on that Sunday. Meanwhile, in southern Chile, the ground had not stopped. 38 hours after the main shock, on the 24th of May, the Cordon Caule volcanic complex erupted. Whether the earthquake triggered it is still debated by volcanologists, but the timing is hard to ignore. The eruption continued for around 59 days, and then, in the mountains east of Valdivia, the survivors discovered that the earthquake had built a bomb. The prolonged shaking had brought down enormous landslides from the slopes above Riñihuazo Lake, and those landslides had fallen directly across the point where the lake drains into the San Pedro River. The outlet was plugged. Rivers, however, do not stop. Water kept flowing into the lake from the mountains and had nowhere to go, so the level began to climb. Every additional meter of height meant roughly 20 million more cubic meters of water held behind a wall of loose landslide debris that no engineer had designed and no one could reinforce. Downstream, along the river valley, lay farms, villages, and finally Valdivia itself, a city that had just been wrecked by an earthquake, whose population was living in damaged houses and improvised shelters, and whose ground had subsided by 2 meters, making it lower and more vulnerable than it had been the week before. The calculation was straightforward and horrifying. If that debris dam failed on its own, the release would be catastrophic and fast. Estimates at the time held that a sudden collapse would destroy the settlements along the river in less than 5 hours. Around 100,000 people lived in the zone at risk. What followed is, to my mind, the part of this story that deserves to be far better known than it is. There was no waiting for help to arrive from somewhere else. There was no equipment coming because the roads and bridges were gone. Under the direction of the engineer Raul Saez, the State Power Company, the Development Corporation, the Public Works Ministry and Army units put hundreds of workers onto the landslide itself, in winter, in the mud, with the water rising behind them, to dig. They cut channels by hand and with whatever machinery could be dragged in. The objective was not to hold the water back, which was impossible, but to control how it left, to lower the top of the barrier deliberately and steadily so that the lake would drain in a manner people downstream could survive, instead of all at once. It was a race against an inflow they could not switch off, conducted while aftershocks continued. Valdivia was prepared for evacuation. Sirens and signals were arranged. People downstream were told which way to run and how much time they would have, which was not much. And the men on the landslide kept digging, in the rain, on unstable ground, above a rising lake, knowing that if the barrier chose to fail while they were standing on it, they would be the first ones it took. They won. The water was let down under control. The work went on for roughly 2 months, and the flooding that eventually reached the valley did real damage, but the catastrophe that had been sitting in those mountains, the one that would have finished off 100,000 people who had already survived the largest earthquake in recorded history, never happened. Chileans call the episode the Riñihuazo. It is one of the great feats of emergency engineering of the 20th century, and outside Chile almost nobody has heard of it. There is no famous photograph of it. There is no monument that travelers stop at. It survives mostly in the memory of the families of the men who were up there, and in the fact that 100,000 people went on with their lives without ever quite knowing how close the thing behind the mountain had come. More than 6 decades later, the 22nd of May, 1960, is still the reference point against which every other earthquake on Earth is measured. Its scientific legacy is enormous. The observation of the planet's free oscillations, that 54-minute hum, opened an entire field of study and gave geophysicists a new way to probe the deep interior of the Earth, in the same way a physician learns about a body from the sound it makes when tapped. The event was also so far beyond the capacity of the old magnitude scales to describe that it helped force a rethink of how earthquakes are measured at all. The scales in use in 1960 were built around the amplitude of particular waves on a seismograph, and above a certain size they stop responding. 2 earthquakes that differ enormously in the energy they release come out with almost the same number. Seismologists call it saturation. The modern moment magnitude scale developed in the following decades measures something physical instead, how much rock moved over how large an area against how much resistance, and only that approach can properly express what happened off Chile. The figure of 9.5 is a modern reassessment. The instruments of the day recorded the event faithfully and simply could not say how big it was. There is also a reason to believe the record may stand indefinitely. The magnitude of a subduction earthquake is governed above all by the length of fault that ruptures at once, and there are only a handful of places on Earth where enough continuous locked boundary exists to produce something on this scale. To beat it, the planet would have to break a longer piece of itself than it managed here. Its practical legacy is written into buildings, and it is worth being precise about why that matters, because it is the one part of this story that saves lives today. Earthquakes do not kill people. Buildings kill people. That sentence is repeated by every seismologist on Earth because it is the only part of the equation human beings control. Nobody can prevent a plate boundary from slipping. Everybody can decide what stands on top of it and how it is reinforced, and whether the inspector who signs it off can be paid to look away. Chile spent the following decades turning the lessons of that weekend into some of the strictest and most respected seismic construction standards anywhere in the world, and the results are measurable. When a magnitude 8.8 earthquake struck the same country in 2010, an event hundreds of times more energetic than earthquakes that have killed hundreds of thousands elsewhere, Chile lost far fewer people than almost anyone would have predicted. That outcome was purchased in 1960 at a price. And some of the legacy is quieter than that. The farmland around Valdivia that dropped 2 meters and filled with water never came back. Over the years it became a wetland, and the wetland filled with birds, and today it is a protected nature sanctuary where black-necked swans nest by the thousand on ground that used to be pasture. The land subsided in 10 minutes, and it has spent 66 years becoming something else. That is, in a way, the whole story of what happened in southern Chile that May. A country that thought the disaster was over on Saturday and was wrong. A city that survived 10 minutes of moving Earth and then watched the ocean withdraw. A coast that was rebuilt somewhere else. A planet that rang for days. And a few hundred people standing on a landslide in the winter rain with shovels, holding back a lake for 100,000 strangers. The largest earthquake ever recorded was not, in the end, the most important thing that happened that week. What mattered more was what people did in the 9 days after it, while the ground was still moving and the water was still rising. Chile is still there, on the same fault, above the same plate, waiting for the same thing to happen again. It always will be. The difference is that now the country knows exactly what it is living on, and it builds accordingly. That knowledge has a date. It begins at 11 minutes past 3 in the afternoon on a Sunday in May in 1960.